Gigantium Mysteria, Chapter 3. The vast arid deserts of the island of Gigantia always had their sandstorms. They were mostly regular enough, but occasionally they could be quite violent, severe in fact, so that they were wild enough to cause so many problems to the Gigantia inhabitants. Occasionally they were so severe that they left and blocked in so many of the houses there. Even the megastructures too themselves had to be dug out of the sandpits. There were many of the block houses, of course, the mega constructions that had gradually emerged, where stranded victims could be trapped inside with limited resources, or even with some of the unknown animals that had slipped in unnoticed to the retreat, the sanctuaries, looking for food, textiles, or medicine, or any number of things, even companionship. Visitors were then trapped with strangers, unknowns, for many weeks or months, until they'd dug themselves out of the giant sandpit they'd been held within. They really hardly knew some of the people, visitors from afar, visitors of family that were staying, or even just ecological tourists that were passing by, people that just happened to be in the neighborhood when the sandstorm hit. Even when you were able to finally all dig yourselves out, after many weeks or months, after a severe sandstorm, and then stopped all the animals whilst inside from defecating everywhere, causing too much mess and stealing from too much, growling at the wrong people, locking them in different rooms of the house until the sandstorm had been past, or one was dug out of it months later. Still, the rest of the town could still be buried, deeper in the sand themselves, the lower parts especially. Even when one was dug out from one's own house, still parts of the village and town could be sanded in. Whole roads were sanded over. Houses that were on the lowlands completely sanded in, with even many of the vehicles needed to get to the remote sanded in villages inaccessible until they were too dug out, and the roads they had to follow dug out also. They'd used so many of these transport vehicles, but there were lots of rocks that protruded out, so they'd have to navigate around those. It was difficult without the signposts that could be buried too. It was such hardship after the severe sandstorms that could be every few years. Sometimes there would be a few in a year, in a bad sandstorm season, in fact. That many were pushed and felt the need to get into more secure housing. Many were making much greater efforts to try and dig themselves out of the giant sandpits. With the waves of sandstorms, though, increasing over the time and becoming more severe, with clusters of them happening in a particularly bad sandstorm season, it became a greater toll and a hardship on the many residents of the island of Gigantia. It took a toll and took lots of time and energy and devotion in digging themselves and their towns and each other out. A constant adapting to the new, greater, more severe waves of the sandstorming, and created much more longer projects for them in building the mega constructions. They were still having to free up the regreening desert projects as well that were partly buried, although those on higher ground were easily to dig out themselves. Some of those areas had reforested to a little extent, and some of those to a greater extent. There were still infant areas, whole nurseries of plants that were being cared for, and much older junior plants also, many tens of thousands of those, that were slowly growing and more mature, and didn't need to be dug out themselves of all the awful sandstorms. Most of the area of the island was still full of wild, arid, quite dry scrubland. They were still quite sparse of too much plant life. There were bare, sparse areas without little. Yet still many animals persisted in living off each other and off the limited produce, the limited plants, fungi, and all the different minerals and nutrients within the soils, the limited amounts that there were. Then there were the new arrivals that finally had come, the first human inhabitants, the human settlers that had arrived from lands afar, from Mysteria, or from a mystery place, who spoke their mystery languages, with their mystery gestures too, who none of the animals could really understand. not in any great deep way. No, not for a long, long time, in fact. They could never converse with them, until they eventually, a few of them, had gradually gotten to know them. When many of the animals, the wilder animals, had long ago departed, of course, and most of the people had then migrated into the growing, immersing, expansive megastructures. The very big house, as it was first called, the mega mansions, that roofed together all the resources of all the foods, the medicines, the textiles, and all the fuel supplies too. All the other gadgetry needs that they had, their technological needs, that were all rooted and grounded in the same place and time, as well as its people that were needed too to function together, so that none went without, and that none were able to be left stranded alone too, when the severest of waves of the sandstorm struck again and again and again. It also solved the problem of those animal invasions too, that had been an escalating problem for some of the decades before. For 30, 40 years, perhaps even 50 or 60, some claimed. These invasive species that had harmed many of the original inhabitants, the earlier colonized workforce that had arrived there. Even 70 or 80 years after, they were still suffering some of the ill effects from some of the animal invasions that persisted and carried on harming people indirectly or directly sometimes. Sometimes they would harm them indirectly by getting into their food or their water supply, where they would defecate there, or where they would cut holes in the containers so that they would leak and spill out sometimes. So that in the giant houses, in the mansions, they would keep giant vaults. The giant vaults of the giant houses kept all the medicine, the food supplies intact, so that they could be securely stored, and so that they could be securely preserved as well, in a good usable condition, to prevent it also from the contamination of the animals that could get in there, that could even swim inside the giant water containers and defecate in it, and defecate also in the food supplies and inside the medicine if it wasn't all securely contained. Or they'd go off and steal it, or fight over each other with it too as well. They even made love to each other sometimes in the giant water containers and scrapped about it inside it too. Inside the thousands of old water containers that each of the houses had to have, each of the towns had gianter ones, really large containers. But each of the houses had their own smaller containers too, multiple containers that they'd have spread throughout the house. They had to all be secured, that had to all be locked up, or have somebody, if they didn't have locks, and many of them didn't have great secure locks, that the animals couldn't easily get within, or secure containers, then those water, food and textile containers had to be guarded. Then that took a lot of time and energy, as the patience of the guards wore thin over much time. All of the towns had even some houses that had their own containers with permanent guards and groups of guards that kept larger containers of food and water on behalf of many others. It was each manned by lots of armed guards and had severely reinforced containers. But it took a lot of manpower, a lot of materials, a lot of time and energy, and a lot of devotion to do that, with so many large containers also to be secured, and vast numbers, when there were vast numbers of houses that didn't always work together as well. In some parts, you couldn't easily guard the water, food, textile, and the medicine containers so easily, as well as keeping a watch also on the house if you were busy digging yourself out of one of the latest sandstorms, however mild it could have been, or if one of the severer ones, it required a lot of maintenance work, a lot of attention, or just during the general day-to-day maintenance work on the farm or the house, or many people were out long term for many weeks, and so many of the houses were only half lived in, with the miners working out long away in the distant quarries, or out reforesting distant patches of the desert still. Besides, there were a lot of people working away, just leaving the skeleton crew behind, where only half a dozen, or a remnant of the people were really left behind then. And they really then had to look after the supplies, as well as maintaining the building and each other, and keeping the building clean and to an adequate hygienic standard as well. So the mega mansions, the mega construction projects, seem really the logical perhaps even an inevitable answer, given the skills that were growing in their construction works, and also now the surplus of materials that they also had access to. One of the giant quarries was seen to have a deep, sturdy foundation. Underneath it, and within it too, its walls were sturdy in the inner sounds of it. And so they fortified the internal walls of the huge quarry. And then they had landscaped it all out, carving it. And then before they had then built up from deep within it, from deep down within its foundations, building up from within the quarry a mega mansion. The first mega mansion only really had roughly 40 floors underneath it, although technically there were an extra couple of floors below that, in some parts of the lowest floor, where archaeological excavation floors in small areas had then been dug out by machines. So there were archaeological floors in some areas where some of the scientists and explorators had visited. The adjoining block buildings had all melted and merged gradually into one larger building, resting in the quarry itself, in that large giant quarry that was then able to support the larger tower on top of it, because deeper, firmer, stronger foundations that could hold it all up. Because of the reinforced large steam builds that looked like a giant skeletal structure, the giant metal support beams, vertical, long columns, held together by horizontal large frames welded into place. The large steel frameworks protruding out like vast, giant megalithic metal structures, like giant megalithic metal men that stood up, or the framework skeletal structures of them until they were fleshed in with all the fabrics and the inner walls. It itself was strong enough and deep enough to hold a vast number of weighty columns, towering up from the earth, towering up high, with its interlocked in towers on top of it, with different spires and all sorts of different designs that it ornamented with it. They were all connected with the long horizontal beams fused into place that securely held everything in place. It never shook, not even a little bit. Not even in the severest of the sandstorms, it stood firm. No animals could crawl under and into its heavily cemented in foundations. Not anymore. No, only another machine strong enough to bury in deeply could ever do that. And none, thankfully, ever yet had. Both the Gemini Towers were a little deeper, going deeper than the Mountaineerers, going perhaps a dozen or so floors deeper still. But the Mountaineerers had then gone even deeper themselves, in almost a race to see how deep they could go. Yet the Geminites didn't really expand a lot deeper then. They stopped at a certain point, not seeing the need for it, feeling that they could grow out and grow up much more. There was no real need to grow that deep anyway, as long as the foundations were fairly firm to hold things in place, and the reinforced steel was that strong and firm and binding, that it didn't need such deep foundations anyway, not to the lengths that the mega mountaineers had later gone to. They did expand out a lot, but in other directions, not deeper. The Geminites had later in the century, they both were also bulkier and much wider and broader. The Geminites were going out in all different directions, on top of and above the ground, rather than deeper below, sprawling out their mega constructions, adapting and fusing with each other as they extended out in all different directions. They had an average of 8,000 rooms on each of their different floors. They had an average of roughly 6.7 people staying in each of their rooms, although that was the average for both of the Geminite towers. They had more family and community-sized rooms, lots of larger rooms than the mega mountaineers did, who only really themselves had averaged at around 2.3 people per room, just over 2 people on average per room. So in each one of the Geminites' mega structures, they had an average of 172 floors. And they had a staggering 8,000 rooms in each of those levels, as an average at least, with a totality of an incredible 1,376,000 rooms in each of the Geminite towers. Then, with the growing new arrivals, with new venturers, new holidayers, vacators, migrants, refugees, and many others that just arrived out of curiosity, it had grown up and was now much vaster in population. Now, one of the towers alone was recorded as having a huge population of over 18 million people, a vast amount. The average of the towers was 9,219,200 people. That was just the average of the Geminite towers. The official story that they gave out, that their rooms were held into high towers often, and sometimes in lower ones on the ground levels, working their way upwards. But what made them interesting and different from the other towers is that the two were identical with each other. It was much cheaper just to produce duplicate materials of everything, and they built them at the same times too, so they could do one project, then after straight away the maintainers and the builders, the mechanics and electronics and plumbers just simply went on to repeat the same journey and the same work that they'd done before. In reality, the total room capacity of one tower was actually now much higher than the other, although roughly the same amount had moved into each one to begin with. Their total combined populations now were over 18 million people. It was recorded as 18,438,421 people, roughly, although who could say exactly how many? About 12.26 million lived in one of the towers, that was later called, much later, the Capital Towers, whilst the other tower had roughly 6.17 million within its house, that was later called the Social House. The twins once functioned much more as one unified building, because they had many connecting bridge houses between them. What were the mega bridges between their two mega structures, their identical mega structures? They were connected megastructures, connected twins that appeared and looked identical, and were also connected intimately to each other, with a great number of both low, medium, and also the higher mega bridges that connected the two megastructures, the megastructure twins. The two identical constructions connected to each other through the multiple low bridges, high bridges, but they were also all mega bridges, whether they were high mega bridges, medium mega bridges, or the lower mega bridges. They'd even adapted to have a few under mega bridges now too, with multiple different bridges connecting to them, and all of course an equally distance from each other, but interestingly also an equal distance from the giant river that flooded and flew between them. It flowing under them steadily. It flowed steadily underneath the mega bridges, where the fish were streaming down underneath those mega bridges up high, and some vastly higher up too. Many passed underneath, of course, passing under the mega bridges, going to visit the area where the mega bridges passed over the mega river. They would go down to visit that part of the whooshing river. Over the decades of the Geminites, they had constructed many vast projects that had sprawled out towards the giant river. Of the Geminite mega construction projects, many had been housed in mega mansions. They'd in fact been housed at the earlier official mega mansion, though some distance, roughly 120 miles, just to the south, and a little bit to the east as well, though not too far to the east. Some of them had once been housed in the original mega mansion itself, the original workers, maintainers, constructors, and many of the original architects too, and some of the original managers of those projects, as well as all of the workers' families too, that had grown up starting while the original Geminite structure was just a skeletal structure in the original first few months and years, through when much of it was that. They'd begun as mountain mountaineers themselves, just living in the mega mansion for the first few years, until later people had then lived inside the Geminite towers, even though only the ground foundations had been built and some of the lower stories, some of the lower floors were fully constructed, and a few of the lower levels. And there had not expanded upwards or outwards to a great extent of that part. They were just really a small Geminite tower then, but still sprawling out, always repleting in their duplicating construction parts of each other, and duplicating the different tasks as well, going from one to the other. Many had then moved away from the Mountaineers, living full-time in the Geminite towers, as the Geminite towers had grown up enough to sufficiently provide all the needs to shelter Geminite people long-term to live sufficiently. And there they remained for a long time, the Geminites, living in their identical towers, growing also identically as well for a long time, where they would mimic each other, the twins, in expanding out both equally, towards each other, towards the giant river, between each other, under the giant bridges that they would each connect towards each other too. The southern influx, then, of the Geminites sprawling over the island of the giants, spreading out all over the Isle of the Giantess, who were then 9 times the size of the Mountaineers themselves, had 9 times the population. So the Geminites really were the ones. They changed the northern landscape of the Isle of the Giants incredibly, in a vast, unimaginable way. The Mountaineers never could have imagined what changes would later happen. The Geminites built lots of giant megastructures, though not to live within themselves. Some of their outbuilding posts were more for the animals to be housed within themselves, extensions of the Gemini towers, identical instructions that they both had in fact. And of course they later built other megastructures too, aside the Gemini towers, the Gemini megastructure towers that they were. They then had a giant stadium, a mega stadium that was built in one of the mountain plateaus nearby the Geminites' towers. For their ceremonial events, they also had it for sports games as well, as many other plays and exhibitions that they would put on too, for crowds that would visit from the island itself, for many tourists that would visit. Many mountaineers in the early days had gone to visit it too. They could be watched by vast crowds of people in the mega stadiums, where several million people could be housed to live within while the shows went on. The shows could last many weeks, in fact. It could take months to prepare for the shows, in fact, and a skeleton crew of workers always lived within the giant stadium, within the mountain plateaus that had sprung up. Within the great vast arena, that later some were not able to get to because of the later avalanches and the rock cascades within some of the mountain areas. But many of the giant stadiums were still easy to get to and had paths that were fairly simple to follow. Whatever the causes, only those in one of the nearest towers of the capital towers could later then access some of the mega arenas that were on the far distant mountain plateaus. Yet many visitors still came to visit the giant arenas, still marvelling at the great sound of millions of people together, and the sight of it also too, in an ocean of faces. That too was incredible, as was the sheer size, the vastness of it. Like a giant rounded cathedral, or like 50 cathedrals joined together. A vastness of it, an overwhelming awesomeness of it too, like a man-made mountain almost. And the giant games that were paraded out there too seemed incredible, an incredible spectacle to witness, to see, to hear. With giant games that involved tens of thousands of people actually on the giant fields themselves. And it just took tens of thousands of people to operate one of the giant machines, or one of the giant puppets even. The shows had many giant puppets that took tens of thousands of people alone to operate. It could take hundreds sometimes even to operate one of the smaller giant machines, or one of the smaller giant puppets, to operate them all in sync. Giant puppets would parade. There'd be giant puppetry dances, where giant dancers would appear to dance, although each of them were operated by many hundreds of people. Even some of the dwarf puppets themselves, that were really giant dwarf puppets, those could take dozens of people, sometimes even 100 to make, and many thousands to really design the mechanisms of and to maintain. There could be anything, any number of different kinds of clays, of the giant people, of the giant ornaments that were mechanical, that could be moved and could move in any number of different ways, of course. There were giant animals that were created and that were moved by tens of thousands of people. And also images that were really of different sculptures. These were moving sculptures and mechanical sculptures that could be moved by hundreds of different people. The mechanical sculptures were all different designs, mechanical moving sculptures that looked authentic sometimes and fanciful other times. The giant moving mechanical sculptures of giant people, but also of giant animals too, many that used to exist and some that still did. And also creatures of mythology, with giant dwarves appearing to move around, with also giant dwarves and giant elves, giant monsters, giant demons, giant angels, giant ogres, giant fairies, giant centaurs, and giant dragons also, that poured great smoke from it and fire, and appeared sometimes to fly, like the giant birds would appear to too, the remote controlled birds that they had also. Then there were the giant mermaids, and they even performed in giant bowls of water that were wheeled on giant machines onto the giant stages, that the millions of people in the giant arenas could cheer and look at in awe. Sometimes they would boo or cheer and make all sorts of sounds at. And then there were the giant machines themselves that rolled on or roared in with their engines, that often featured in the various giant shows, in the giant parades, with the giant exhibitions that happened often. It was just often a parade of some of the giant truckers, the giant lorries, giant diggers, giant excavators, giant bulldozers, lorries, loaders. There were the giant loaders, giant compactors, giant scrapers, giant dumpsters, giant trenchers, giant cranes even, some of those ones that had helped to build the first giant arenas themselves, but had stayed on to be adapted for later other shows. Many out of service now were used, ones that had been used in construction machinery before. They were later readapted, of course, adapted into mutant vehicles, dressed up in colourful foliage, or painted decorated colours, or attached with lights that would glow in the night and flashed all different preceded colours in different sequins. And they appeared in all different guises in their highly performances. All manner of different things that were paraded. They could host up to 2.3 million people within them. It was an incredible thing because they were intended to host the entirety of all the twins, the Geminites that visited from their towers. Megalopians and the Megamountaineers. Long ago, a giant building had been built, and this by far had a giant population. And even gianter groups of people too. The gianter groups of people. They were the giant groups. There were never any giant people though, only giant groups. The giant groups had lived and died, struggled, partied, survived, worked, played, and all manner of things, had often thrived but sometimes struggled within the vast monolithic complexes. Generations after generations who'd inherited the giant megastructures had devoted so much time and energy to maintaining, to cleaning, to restoring, to upkeeping the giant buildings they'd inherited, as well as sometimes neglecting it, damaging parts of it, wearing it down gradually over long expanses of time, and then sometimes vandalizing it suddenly too, even accidentally sometimes, and sometimes on purpose, as well as going to great lengths to learn and to repair it and maintain it often too, often even adapting and encouraging and extending out the giant megastructures too. The mega mansion was one of the earliest megastructures and the grandest of its time in scope and style. By far at that age, it had many significant adaptations. Over the century, its original dimensions were already vast in scope, and its sheer size had been awesome at that time. Grandiose, incredible only to the foreigners who knew little about it, though, certainly not to later Geminites, not to the Megalopians, only from those at a great distance, to foreigners who knew nothing about the Isle of Gigantium Mysteria, nothing about it at all. To those that were foreigners to Gigantium Mysteria, it really was still awesome to behold, to see, to look at, to experience, to live within, of course. Even to read about or to think about at great length could seem strange. You could see the great giant from over 200 miles away, the mega mountain that was, Mega Mountaineering, as it was called by some. The mega mountain was seen by over 200 miles distance if it was clear weather and there were no obstacles that had stood between it and you. From that particular vantage point, it could sometimes be seen for as much as 200 miles by the naked eye. If there was, of course, the vast sprawl of farmlands and the woodlands that were surrounding it, if you were stood at that particular vantage point, stood at sea level, you could see it from 200 miles still. In size, it was comparable to a small mountain, perhaps. Yet its shape was not pyramidal or rectangular, perhaps. It was, in fact, a large kind of cubic rectangular shape. The mega mountain stood tall, giant and aloof, alone to begin with, towering over the swirl of lower trees surrounding it, appearing to rise up out of the green sprawl itself. The mega mountains, as it was officially called, or the big house, colloquially by locals, as it was more commonly known, it had originally been built to host the colony of workers, who were all housed deeply inside, because of its close proximity to many uncultivated forests and the unmined deserts. For generations, many of the labourers, the workers, their families, the managers of the company, had all foraged out of the woodlands, cultivating orchards, allotments, farmyards, gathering and growing, and generally harvesting food, medicine, textiles, even spring water, timber, and the fuel from those mines and from the reforested areas. And they also garnered many metals too, that were seen to be of great precious value to the mega mansion residents themselves, as well as also with others that they could trade with. The farmers, lumberjacks, miners, foragers, gardeners, the fishers, the landscapers, building constructors too, the mechanics and the cleaners and the maintainers, and all the different managers, the architects and the admin workers of the actual construction work itself and its actual construction building. They all lived within the actual building itself, and all their growing families lived within it too. As well, of course, there were many other providing needs for them. The butchers, the bakers, chefs, cooks, cleaners, weavers, artists even, painters and decorators, stylists, fabricators, furnishers, those maintenance workers, plumbers, electricians, technicians of all different kinds. Then, of course, there were many administerial, secretarial workers also that were needed to help the social fabric function within the house. And then, of course, there were the many traders who had to sell many of the exported products at their small mansion port that they had nearby. There were the many transport drivers, stockers, storers, and security staff also that lived within the complex. There were a great many other professions, many doctors and teachers of the professions too, that also lived within the house complex as well. There were many other also that were involved in the production of the produce as well, and in many other different aspects of those productions of the materials themselves. Yet they were all living together, whatever the very different professions that they had were, all living now under one roof, under one mega structured roof indeed, in one giant construction, in one consolidated building. Yes, even the managers and their admin workers, they also lived in the same building too, albeit they all lived on many different floors of the building itself, because it was a vast building in size. Because of the technological developments of the greater, stronger, faster, and even the more precise machinery, they needed more and more people to be able to efficiently run, to restore, and to maintain it all. However, gradually, many of the older professionals had become increasingly redundant, with many of the machines in overdrive. Only a handful of people were then needed as the machine's abilities had gradually expanded and adapted more and more, so that only a handful now of the people were now needed in jobs that had once required much larger numbers of people. Small numbers could now do jobs that had once required many hundreds of people. Many of the mega mansion residents now had more time, therefore, on their hands, both to maintain each other and also the giant megastructures themselves that had struggled through the years of heavier working, through the labouring they'd all done. They had declined in their functioning to some varying extent, and there was more time now for people to care for the constructions themselves, as well as also the residents held within them, the animals, the people, and all the other visitors as well. There was a lot more time also to hurt each other, as well as also helping and caring for each other too. A lot more time to damage and vandalize the buildings, as well as to care and maintain the buildings too. A lot more time for everything, it seems. Time to do good and to restore the buildings, and time to degrade and to vandalize the buildings also. The transport shutters between the big house and some of the many woodlands, and the mines also, they were still often functional. Many of them still were. There was a curious mixture of journeyers, of those training out for the day or for a night to visit, going out by the long train tracks that were sealed under long tube connections, that ran out from the megastructure, going out to the mines or reforested areas, or inhospitable desert areas of interest still, those areas that could perhaps be mined or reforested later. A minority of the workers and the machine operators and maintenance workers, and a few technicians also, were often seen going out on those long train track journeys, journeying out along the ground. Then there were the sightseers that would go out of the megastructure themselves, those that would leave as tourists for the day, visiting the orchards that were slowly growing up, just to look at it for the interest and curiosity, as well as enjoying it, not because they were needed there to work it any more, or to go and visit a remote woodland retreat, or even taking a tour of one of the old mines from long ago, those that were still open, to look about their history and geology, perhaps, and of interest. Scientists on a field trip, or perhaps just young lovers escorting each other out for a more remote location that was less public and more discreet for them. Then the crowded mega mountainers who were going out, families on a weekend break, just looking for a break away from their domestic chores at home, a change of scenery, something more interesting, more provocative, more inspiring in landscape and scenery, something altogether different to do. A break from their old domestic chores and jobs at home, perhaps. Breakaway families that went out, and remote lovers seeking discretion, and also curious scientists driven out to them too. Yet you could live all your life inside the grand old building of the mega mansion for many years without ever necessarily needing to ever go out, because it provided all of the essential needs within the confining walls. Indeed, there were some that had never ventured out, never wanted to, never needed to, really, or never saw that they needed to. Albeit they were perhaps a minority, there was still a large majority though. They only felt they needed to go out occasionally, very rarely perhaps some. Since the mega mansion could now provide for all their basic material needs, without really the urgent need to go out and forage in the woodlands oneself, or to go out and mine for the metals oneself. A minority of workers contained. They did still go out, training out, and they still ventured out sometimes, out of the mega mansion, They left the mega mansion, going out of the big house. Others left out of curiosity, just to see where their ancestors, their father or great grandfathers had used to work, where grandparents had told stories from, or to hear historical tour guides to tell them about ancestral workplaces, ancestral miners, ancestral foresters. Others wanted to escape their rooms or to escape the little house inside the big house that they could not fully explore all the different floors of, or just to have a break away from other people that they typically spent more time with. Many others were just looking for inspiration or somewhere beautiful or different, a scene to film the film, perhaps, or to set the novel within. There were large sprawls of mowed lawns that were surrounding the mega mansion, where crowds could gather within. There were the sports games they played there, the dances they held, and there were the various yoga classes, exercise classes, educational classes, all sorts, clusters of deck chairs, people that were watching some dance or drama unfold gradually, great rows and rows of them, many clusters of hundreds here, scattered here and there, hundreds here, thousands there, that clustered together in their different groups, in the vast lawns that were many miles long out in all different directions. Many more sat out in the lawns, picnicking out in different directions, sat out in the outside tables that were scattered around in different gatherings. Hundreds of picnic tables that were placed in their different orders, in different groups, separate and spaced out with each other for the different groups of the house. Sometimes there'd even be a mass of many thousands of picnic tables with vaster groups of the mega mansion that could all eat together. But often there were just little collections of just dozens of picnic tables together, or even a few remote ones scattered where there could be half a picnic table or even a quarter here and there. Sometimes there would just be a bench, and sometimes it would only just be a half a bench that was scattered around the place. Lots of people were out sitting up to those various benches, different size benches too, some that could easily facilitate up to 50 or 60 people for larger group gatherings, others that could fit hundreds of people round them. Other tables were typically much smaller for nuclear families, with only room for 5 or 6 people typically, and those were tens of thousands of the picnic tables that were situated all over the vast lawns, sprawling around the mega mansions. Many people sat outside to eat in the lawns of the mega mansions, therefore, to sit out there to discuss, to take laptops out, to read on, or they would sometimes just sit out there to talk to other people as a way of meeting people, or just for get some fresh air, to be under the elements when you sat out having evening dinner or breakfast or any lunchtime. The condition of the lawns was of course a big issue though, as some have been churned up by the games. There were the game areas of the lawn that were separate from the sitting down, eating areas of it, where people churned up the lawns and they had to be regrown every so often. Although the condition of them was debated in the in-between areas, in areas that were partly for games, but also for social gatherings too, social dances, social get-togethers, and also for social consultations, social lunches, and also where people just sat down for the social classes, exercise classes, yoga classes, and the educational classes. The common condition of those lawns was discussed and debated at length during many of those classes indeed.